Everybody, and welcome to today's lesson dedicated to the IELTS exam. The plan is every Thursday at this time to give a lesson focusing on this exam, and hopefully you can join me, and hopefully you are preparing for the exam as well, and I can try to help you with some tips and advice for every part of the exam. Today is the second lesson, and you might remember last week we explained every part of the exam, but my connection failed last week after 15 minutes, and I subsequently continued speaking for maybe 30 minutes, and the lesson had finished. I did not realize. Anyway, today we'll begin with one exercise, and specifically the academic reading exercise. So there's a general reading and an academic reading. In fact, there's a general English exam for IELTS and there's an academic IELTS exam. So today we will begin in relation to the reading for academic. The reading is different for academic and general. The speaking and the listening are the same, and the writing is different as well for academic and for general. So let's begin. It might be difficult, but I will try to help you with this exercise. I have not seen this exercise yet, so I'm new to this exercise also, and we can learn together and we can go together. I'm feeling a little bit with the flu, so I might have a short lesson, and I'm feeling a little bit unwell, but let's see. I think we have enough energy to do the first exercise together. So as I said, this is the academic reading sample, and this is called matching features. So you can see it's very small, and I tried to make it a little bit bigger now so we can see everything together. And let's begin. So first we will probably read the text, and then we will look at the questions. So first it's important to read the instructions, of course, and that is perfect now. So I'll just move my screen here. So this is an extract from an academic reading passage on the development of rockets. Very peculiar, very specific topic on the development of rockets. Very odd, very specific. The text preceding this extract explored the slow development of the rocket and explained the principle of propulsion. So it's important for the context that before this section in the book, this extract, we had the text exploring the slow development of the rocket in terms of history, and after the principle of propulsion. Okay, so that's just to give you an idea of the position of this extract. Okay, so here obviously we have a long text and we have some questions. So probably it's a good idea to look at the questions first ourselves before beginning the exercise, to keep in mind. And a good idea might be, of course, for you to try this exercise yourself first. Therefore, I suggest you maybe take a picture, or you press pause, or you go to the IELTS website and you find the academic matching example here, and you can try this exercise yourself first. And then if you are stuck in relation to vocabulary, in relation to explaining the answers, this video hopefully will help you. However, I will have some doubts myself because the reading exercise always is challenging. So it's possible I will have some doubts for me doing this exam. Okay, so for questions 7 to 10, look at the following items, questions 7 to 10, and the list of groups below. Okay, so you have the list of groups. Match each item with the group which first invented or used them. So the key here is the group which first invented or used them. So for example, black powder. Who were the first group who invented or used black powder? Rocket-propelled arrows for fighting. Who was the first group to use or invent rocket-propelled arrows for fighting? Rockets as war weapons. Who was the first group to invent or to use them? And finally, the rocket launcher. Who was the first group to use the rocket launcher or to invent the rocket launcher? You have the option A for Chinese, B for Indians, C for British, D for Arabs, or E for the Americans. Okay, so very interesting for sure. Maybe it's a good idea to take a picture and put the picture beside you during this lesson. So if you want to take a screenshot and remember the options during the lesson while we read the text, that might be a very good idea to do. So let's go back to the start. Some people prefer immediately to look for black powder and to look for the answer immediately, and that's a very good idea. So you can do that if you wish. You can try to find the reference for black powder in the text and therefore try to immediately find who is the group that used or invented them first. And that's a good tactic, that's a good technique. The next would be the same with the rocket propelled arrows for fighting. You can look for the reference in the text and try to find the answer immediately. Obviously, that's a good idea. However, today, during this lesson, I want to try and explain some more vocabulary and try to understand the text. Of course, on the day of the exam, it's not necessary to understand everything, no problem. You can just try and find the answer. But today, I want to try and explain to you the logic of most of the vocabulary. So let's begin. The invention of rockets is linked inextricably with the invention of black powder. Most historians of technology credit the Chinese with its discovery. They base their belief on studies of Chinese writings or on the notebooks of early Europeans who settled in or made long visits to China to study its history. That's my dog. He wants to go in. Sorry, give me one moment again. So you can read this for a moment and I return in 2 seconds. Oh. Now, it is amazing every time I sit down to start a lesson. Maybe the majority of the times I sit down to start a lesson, the dog then wants to go in, of course. Okay, so most historians of yes, so we started here. It is probably that sometime in the 10th century, black powder was first compounded from its basic ingredients of saltpetre, charcoal, and sulfur. But this does not mean that it was immediately used to propel rockets. By the 13th century, powder-propelled fire arrows had become rather common. The Chinese relied on this type of technological development to produce incendiary projectiles of many sorts, explosive grenades, and possibly cannons to repel their enemies. One such weapon was the basket of fire, or, as directly translated from Chinese, the arrows like flying leopards. The 0.7 meter long arrows, each with a long tube of gunpowder attached near the point of each arrow, could be fired from a long octagonal shaped basket at the same time and had a range of 400 paces. Another weapon was the arrow as a flying saber, which could be fired from crossbows. The rocket, placed in a similar position to other rocket propelled arrows, was designed to increase the range. A small iron weight was attached to the 1.5 bamboo shaft just below the feathers to increase the arrow's stability by moving the center of gravity to a position below the racket. At a similar time, the Arabs had developed the egg, which moves and burns. This egg was apparently full of gunpowder and stabilized by a 1.5 meter tail. It was fired using two rockets attached to either side of its tail. It was not until the 18th century that Europe became seriously interested in the possibilities of using the rocket itself as a weapon of war and not just to propel other weapons. Prior to this, rockets were used only in pyrotechnic displays. The incentive for the more aggressive use of rockets came not from within the European continent, but far away from India, whose leaders had built up a corps of rocketeers and used rockets successfully against the British in the late 18th century. The Indian rockets used against the British were described by a British captain serving in India as an iron envelope about 200 millimeters long and 400 millimeters in diameter, with sharp points at the top and a 3-meter long bamboo guiding stick. In the early 19th century, the British began to experiment with incendiary barrage rockets. The British rocket differed from the Indian version in that it was completely encased in a stout iron cylinder, terminating in a conical head, measuring 1 meter in diameter and having a stick almost 5 meters long and constructed in such a way that it could be firmly attached to the body of the rocket. The Americans developed a rocket complete with its own launcher to use against the Mexicans in the mid 19th century. A long cylindrical tube was propped up by 2 sticks and fastened to the end of the launcher, thereby allowing the rockets to be inserted and lit from the other end. However, the results were sometimes not that impressive, as the behavior of the rockets in flight was less than predictable. Okay, and again, just to remind you of the questions, the question is, who were the first group who invented or used black powder? The Chinese, the Indians, the British, the Arabs, or the Americans? Number 8, who were the first group who used or invented the rocket-propelled arrows for fighting? Okay, and number 9, who were the first group who used or invented rockets as war weapons? And number 10, who were the first group who used or invented the rocket launcher? Okay, difficult because during the text I noticed a couple of the answers more or less, but now I need to go back and try and find directly the first answer for black powder. I know this was at the beginning of the text between the Chinese and maybe the Europeans, but I was not sure, so maybe I need to read again. The invention of the rocket is linked inextricably with the invention of black powder. This basically means it's impossible to separate. So the two inventions of black powder and rockets are almost connected to the invention. Okay. The majority of historians credit the Chinese with its discovery. So the majority of historians, the difficult part here is credit. This is a verb, so they give credit to the Chinese for the discovery. So it is a verb to credit you for doing something, and therefore here I think is the answer. So the Chinese are probably the group who invented black powder, according to most historians. And the next sentence is nothing to contradict that. So the next sentences do not really contradict that. Okay, so I think the first answer is the Chinese. So let's suggest that the first answer is A. Okay, so 7A. I think I need to make a note of this in my book here. So let's say 7A. Rocket propelled arrows for fighting. We need to find this in the text. Rocket propelled arrows for fighting. So let's look at the text again. We continue. So, but this does not mean that it was immediately used to propel rockets. By the 13th century, powder propelled fire arrows had become rather common. So this is the issue. This is the topic we are interested in now. Here, clearly, we must find who was the first group to invent or to start using this particular weapon. The Chinese relied on, that's a very important verb with the significance, depended on. The Chinese depended on this type of technological development to produce incendiary projectiles of many sorts, explosives, grenades, and possibly cannons to repel their enemies. Okay, so basically the Chinese used them, but we don't know if who was the first. One such weapon was the basket of fire, as directly translated from Chinese. The arrows like flying leopards, and again, it's just a description of the weapon. Another weapon was the arrow with the flying saber. Again, another description just of the type of weapon, and more description. Here, I don't see specifically who invented it. I don't see any reference to any group who first used it. Maybe the Chinese again, possibly. But let's continue. And we stopped here. So at the similar time, the Arabs had developed the egg which moves and burns. This egg was apparently full of gunpowder and stabilized by 1.5 million tael. It was fired using 2 rockets attached to either side. So this is the first mention of a group. So is it the Arabs who are created the weapon? I'm not sure. So let's go back to the start again, because I'm not clear. So they base their belief on studies of Chinese writings or notebooks of early Europeans who settled in or made long visits to China. Okay. It is probable that sometime in the 10th century, black powder was first compounded from its basic ingredients. Okay, but this does not mean that it was immediately used to propel rockets. By the 13th century, powder-propelled arrows became rather common. So again, I think the only evidence we have is the Chinese again. So let's say the next answer is also the Chinese. Okay, that's the only really indication of the answer for me. So let's move to the next. And fortunately, if you read the question, we're very fortunate because you may use any letter more than once. It is possible to use a letter a second time. That is good news because already we have used Chinese, the Chinese group, twice. Okay, now we look for rockets as war weapons. So we have already discussed the rocket. So let's see. This sentence. So the egg was apparently full of gunpowder and stabilized by a 1.5 meter tail. It was fired using 2 rockets attached to either side. Let's continue because I'm not sure if that's the answer. It was not until the 18th century that Europe became seriously interested in the possibilities of using the rocket itself as a weapon of war, not just to propel other weapons. Prior to this, rockets were used only in pyrotechnic displays. The incentive for more aggressive use of rockets came not from within Europe continent, but far away India, whose leaders had built up a corps of rocketeers and used rockets successfully against the British in the late 18th century. The Indian rockets used against the British were described as an iron envelope. So, therefore, I think the Indians were the first group to use the rocket. That's my interpretation. As war weapons, I would say 9 is the Indians, 9B, I think. Again, I could be wrong, but that's my first impression. Next, we need to find a rocket launcher. So I think at the end, we've seen some information about the rocket launcher. So here, in the early 19th century, the British began to experiment with incendiary barrage rockets after the Indians. Okay, so the Indians were first. Yes, the British started to use them, but it was after the Indians started using them. Okay, so now we're looking for the rocket launcher. So here we go. The Americans developed a rocket complete with its own launcher. Very clear, very easy to use against the Mexicans in the mid-19th century. Therefore, clearly, the Americans invented or started using first the rocket launcher. Therefore, number 10, I think, is E. So we have 7A, 8A, and let's check the answers at the bottom here. Hopefully it's 7A, 8A, 9B. Yeah, okay, so everything is good. That seemed very comfortable. That seemed very easy, I would suggest. And I think here, yes, I have the website, so sorry, I was going to make that a bit smaller. This is the website I recommend for you to visit. Obviously, it's the IELTS official website, so I'm sure you probably have visited it already. And here you can see the academic reading section, and the first one was matching features. Now we have time, and I'm feeling probably enough energy to do the next exercise, table completion. Okay, so let's try this together, and this will be important because this is a different style of writing. Okay, so let's close all this and let's look specifically at this one exercise again in a different style. So I'll make it bigger again so you can see everything clearly, and let's read the instruction. So this is the academic reading and it's the table completion. Here we have another article, another text from a book. So this is an extract from an academic reading passage on the subject of dung beetles. So a very peculiar topic again, a very specific topic, and maybe a bit difficult for this reason. The text preceding this extract gave some background information, background facts about dung beetles, and continued to describe a decision to introduce non-native varieties to Australia. Okay, so here we just check, we have a full article again, and then we have a table. So let's look at the table because it's very important to begin this table first. Basically, you need to complete the table below. Choose no more than 3 words from the passage for each answer. So the maximum is 3 words for each answer. Write your answers in boxes 9 to 13. So the species of the dung beetle, French, the size is 2.5 centimeters for the French dung beetle. The preferred climate for the French dung beetle is cool. The complementary species for the French dung beetle is the Spanish, and start of active period for the French dung beetle is late spring. The number of generations per year is 1 to 2. However, for the Spanish species of the dung beetle, the size is 1.25 centimeters. The preferred climate, we don't know. And complementary species, 0. Start of the active period, we don't know. Number of generations per year, we don't know. And then finally, the South African ball roller species of the dung beetle, size is not important. Preferred climate, we don't know. Complementary species, we don't know. Again, I suggest maybe you take a picture of this table and you try to have this picture beside you at the same time. Alternatively, you can try to do this completely yourself first. You can follow the link on the website, find the document and practice this yourself, and I can try to give you some tips now in relation to doing the answers. Okay, so let's go back to the top and we read a little. So, very specific topic, a bit difficult. Introducing dung beetles into a pasture is a simple process. Approximately 1,500 beetles are released, a handful at a time, into fresh cow pats in the cow pasture. The beetles immediately disappear beneath the pats, digging and tunneling, and if they successfully adapt to their new environment, soon become a permanent, self-sustaining part of the local ecology. In time, they multiply, and within 3 or 4 years, the benefits to the pasture are obvious. Dung beetles work from the inside of the pat, so they are sheltered from predators such as birds and foxes. Most species burrow into the soil and bury dung in tunnels directly underneath the pats, which are hollowed out from within. Some large species directly underneath the pats, which are hollowed out from within. Some large species originated from France, excavate tunnels to a depth of approximately 30 centimeters below the dung pat. These beetles make sausage-shaped brood chambers along the tunnels. The shallowest tunnels belong to a much smaller Spanish species that buries dung in chambers that hang like fruit from the branches of a pear tree. South African beetles dig narrow tunnels of approximately 20 centimeters below the surface of the pat. Some surface-dwelling beetles, including a South African species, cut perfectly shaped balls from the pat, which are rolled away and attached to the bases of plants. For maximum dung burial in spring, summer and autumn, farmers require a variety of species with overlapping periods of activity. In the cooler environments of the state of Victoria, the large French species, 2.5 centimeters long, is matched with similar half this size temperate climate Spanish species. The former are slow to recover from the winter cold and produce only 1 or 2 generations of offspring from late spring until autumn. The latter, which multiply rapidly in early spring, being a subtropical beetle, prefers the climate of a northern and coastal New South Wales, where it commonly works with the South African tunnelling species. In warmer climates, many species are active for longer periods of time. And dung is the droppings or excretion of animals, the, the obviously the smelly content is another description I would give it. And the cowpats are droppings of cows. So interesting for sure. So let's look at the answer immediately, and some people go directly to the answer, and that's fine. So what is the preferred climate of the Spanish dung beetle? First, we must find a reference for the Spanish dung beetle and the climate preferred. So let's begin again. And nothing in the first paragraph related to Spanish. Here is the first reference to Spanish species. So let's check the sentence before. Some large species originated from France excavate tunnels to a depth of approximately 30 centimeters below the dung pad. These beetles make sausage-shaped brood chambers along the tunnels. And so this is for protection. Okay. And the shallowest tunnels belong to a much smaller Spanish species that buries dung in chambers that hang like fruit from the branches. So the tunnels are shallowest. But what is the question? The question is preferred climate. We don't know yet. So let's continue, because that's the first reference of the Spanish one. South African beetles dig narrow tunnels of approximately 20 centimeters below the surface of the path. And again, nothing here in relation to the climate. So let's continue. Here again, we have the second mention and reference to the Spanish species. So let's read the sentence. In the cooler environments of the state of Victoria, the large French species is matched with smaller temperate climate species. So the answer is probably, well, let's continue. The former is the French species and the latter is the Spanish species. So here is a second mention of the Spanish species in relation to the climate, which multiply rapidly in early spring. So probably the most comfortable conditions for the Spanish species, because it's the latter, is probably early spring. So I think the answer for one is early spring. And let's continue to the next question. That was number 9, in my opinion, because they're more comfortable in that environment. Now, number 10, number 10, well, actually, we can continue on the preferred climate if you wish for number 12. What is the preferred climate of the South African beetle? So again, we look for the reference for the South African beetle, and let's see what we can find. Here is the first mention, South African beetles. No, nothing related to the climate, but here is the second mention of the South African beetle. So the South African ball rolling species, being a subtropical beetle, prefers the climate of northern and coastal South Wales, where it commonly works with the South African tunnel species. So what is the climate of New South Wales? And we don't know. So we need to find some reference to the northern. So Victoria is the cool state, but Victoria is not the same as the South African. Okay, so subtropical beetle is below tropical. So I think it's cooler. So the answer could be cool. Again, cooler, I think, would be the answer for number 12. I'm not 100% sure. I don't see that very, very clearly, but let's continue to number 13 or number 10. Okay, the start of the active period for the Spanish beetle. When is the start of the active period? Maybe it's the spring again. So let's look for the first reference again of the Spanish. So there's nothing about the active period. And let's see the second reference to the Spanish species. The latter. So maybe early spring. Possibly early spring again. That's my only possible answer in relation to that. In fact, I think this is the correct answer first, the temperate climate. So let's change my answer. The temperate climate, I think, is the correct answer for number 10, for number 9. And then therefore early spring is probably the answer for number 10. Okay, that's my opinion. Because more active is when you produce the offspring. Number 11, the number of generations per year for the Spanish. So let's continue to the text, and we're looking specifically for the number of generations. The latter, the Spanish species, multiply rapidly, produce 2 to 5 generations annually. So that's very, very clear. So the answer for number 11 is 2 to 5 generations. Number 13 is here. And the question, what is the question for number 13? The complementary species for the South African ball roller. What is the complementary species? I think already we have seen this in the last sentence. So the South African ball rolling species prefers the climate, okay, where it commonly works with the South African tunneling species. So therefore, I think that's the partner. And the correct answer is the South African tunneling species for number 13. Let's check the answer. Number 9 was the temperate. Let's see if we're correct. Temperate. Number 10 is early spring. Yes. Number 11 is 2 to 5. Yes. Number 12 is subtropical. We said cool. So number 12 is incorrect. Number 12 is subtropical. And number 13 was the South African tunneling. So we have 4 correct from 5. Not bad. So they are 2 styles of the IELTS, correcting the IELTS reading.